little seems to be outside the realm of possibility. There are companies that print edible food now, with the hamburger being the popular test product. While you can eat it and it will keep you alive, a printed hamburger doesn't yet have the consistency or taste of the real thing, but that's coming. The founder of PayPal, Peter Thiel, just donated $350,000 to a research group making this a reality. If there are any old Star Trek fans out there, remember when Kirk went to get his dinner and pushed a couple buttons and out popped whatever he asked for? Well, that sort of thing is going to be a reality within a career span of some in the room. Consider some of the knock-on effects of large-scale local on-demand printing. As I mentioned, what I do largely becomes obsolete. So does what many trucking companies and air freight companies do. Without all those ships, planes, trucks burning fuel, the demand for energy is not going to be what it otherwise would have been. No one will care if the longshoremen go on strike. The oceans will be a much less crowded place, and command of the global commons will have a very different meaning than it has now. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to take questions.
So we got some microphones here for anybody that has any questions here. I guess my first question is, can we use 3D printer to print more sailors?
We're still working on that part. I got my sailor problems too. So.
All right, anybody?
Yes, sir.
Sir, can you comment on how the expansion of the Panama Canal can change global commerce? Or, I mean, you didn't touch to it, but is there a lot of change with that on the horizon?
You know, boy, there's an awful lot of discussion about that. I was in Washington yesterday on that very topic, because CNO has a particular interest in it. But here's kind of where we are. First, you know, the canal project is behind schedule, somewhat substantially, and it's because of the locks. The locks are probably the most ambitious, complicated engineering project in civil engineering that's been undertaken in a long, long time, if ever. And they're way behind on it. And right now, I think they're thinking about maybe the new locks are going to be a year and a half late by the time they're done. So it's hard to say when, if ever, it will really open. Were it to actually happen, the locks, the expanded Panama Canal has as its target, it was built and depends on Asia to the east coast of the United States trade. That's why it was built, and that's what it needs to be profitable. West Coast ports in the United States and Canada recognize this, as do railroads. That is the main competitor. Once upon a time, about 90% of East Coast cargo that came from Asia was offloaded in the West and railed across the United States. That's how you got all your stuff from China. During a long-shore strike on the West Coast a few years ago, most shippers realized that they better have Plan B. And so an all-water route to the East Coast was developed, and West Coast lost a lot of share. They're down, I forget the exact number, but somewhere in the 65-60% range, somewhere in that neighborhood. So the Panama Canal is not indispensable to us as far as trade goes. So the real question is whether or not an expanded canal will be able to capture more trade volume, basically steal share from the West Coast ports and the railroads. There are a couple of other things to consider. On the east coast of the United States, there's only one port that at present is capable of handling a fully loaded post-Panamax container ship, and that's Norfolk. The other ports they'll say they can handle post-Panamax container ships, but they're not deep enough to handle them completely. Dredging in this country has largely come to a stop. You know, the Army Corps Engineer budget is really one giant string of earmarks, and when the war on earmarks happened, one of the fallouts to that is dredging projects kind of came to an end. So there's a depth problem in many ports. The Port of New York, without which nobody, I think, can reasonably put together an all-water service anywhere without New York, because it's the biggest container port on the East Coast, has a problem with the Bayonne Bridge, which is too low. So we have an air draft issue there, and you know, the Panamanians are up there all the time begging them to raise that bridge. But you know, that's not an easy thing to do either. So there's a lot of infrastructure investment still to be done in the United States on to get that. But the long story short is no one really knows what the cargo diversion is going to look like, because a lot depends on when it actually happens and what the pricing scheme are. The Panamanians have made it clear that they're going to depart from their current pricing scheme and go for a pricing scheme to maximize profit. So it's going to cost more to get through there. So there's a lot of variables. I don't think what you'll see at the end of the day is a huge shift in trade patterns, excluding what may or may not happen regionally in the South America, Central America region. How much volume shifts, I don't think anybody really has a clue. I think the Panamanians will tell you that it's going to be massive, because unlike the first canal, this time they paid for it by borrowing money and they get to sell bonds, and they're not going to get investors if they can't paint a rosy picture. But in truth, I don't know. In fact, in my mind, purely the biggest risk here is that the Panamanians don't see the volume that they get, or for some reason it just keeps getting pushed back and back and back and back, and they run into problems on the bonds that they, paying the debt on the bonds that they borrow. So, and if they need help paying that money, I'm sure China will be able to step in and help. Anything else?
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Your Raider Ham project is very interesting, but what's Maersk's position or incentive to do that? Isn't that change the whole profile of your shipping, basically white shipping to now and along with the West Asian conflict start?
The motivation for us to do it is, safe and secure global commerce. Again, I'm very well aware that the environment we find ourselves in didn't happen by accident. So we're happy to help anytime we can. We do a lot of this sort of stuff with the Navy. This happens to be the program I talked about. At the moment, we don't believe, and it's something we have to worry about, we don't believe that it changes our profile at all. We're not doing anything that Lloyd's doesn't do with their AIS Live program, where they capture all this data and sell it to people. If you want to pay the bucks to Lloyd's, you can buy the same sort of stuff, except it's all based on shore-based systems rather than a mobile one. And ours won't be public, it's certainly private. That's why when I say if we're in port, we have to be careful with what do with our cameras. The Israelis, for instance, are very particular about taking pictures of their port, so cameras get turned off when we're there. So we're mindful of that line, but we do not believe that at the moment we cross it. Yes, sir.
Sir, you mentioned the 3D printers and implications for international trade in the long term. My thought on that is, won't you still need raw materials to be moving back and forth? And so it's not how much trade will change. You're still going to have to move all this massive material. It's just what moves that will change.
That's true. And that's what I said. There'll still always be shipping, but it's going to be low-value stuff. What the ultimate amount and type of low-value stuff, and it's largely, looking in the big crystal ball, going to be commodities. But, we're certainly going to need a lot less oil than we need now. So it's what type of commodities, and it's going to be low-value stuff, and how much. And, if a lot of the printing is done with carbon nanofibers and things like that, that's a different type of stuff. So absolutely, there'll still always be some ships out there, but the container ship will be a thing of the past type of thing. I think, 50 years out, that's probably where we're headed. Yes, sir.
Stephen, the Hampton Roads maritime communities and the Hampton Roads Navy and Coast Guard have a lot to learn from each other. But it seems like there are relatively few opportunities for the two groups to mix, especially at the operator level. Can you suggest any Hampton Roads maritime fora or activities we should crash and help develop the friendship?
I agree that there is a sector security committee, which is a Hampton Roads area industry government thing the Coast Guard hosts, but it's mostly focused on security issues related directly to the port. And I do believe that we don't do enough of that sort of stuff, and frankly, I don't know of much other than the Hampton Roads Sector Security Committee that we could do. But again, I'd love to see more exercises and things like that to get done. I don't know. It's something I struggle with myself. One good clearinghouse, perhaps, is the Hampton Roads Maritime Association. They at least are a forum for everybody to get together and talk about that sort of stuff. The Navy only has one representative on that. That's the commander of the naval station, has a seat in that group by default, whoever he happens to be. But that would be a great forum to talk about how do we get together and talk a little bit more about what we do and how we do it, and where things that you do and what we do might impact each other. Yes, sir.
Sir, follow-up question on the 3D printer. The raw materials for that, are those commonplace throughout the world, or is there a particular country that has a corner on that market? I mean, that may be the next oil type of resource in the world.
At this point, I'm not a total expert on this sort of stuff. I watch it from the perspective of threats to my industry, but I think it's the industry is still a little bit too premature to get there, so I don't know. But on that vein, I will tell you that the next oil, at least initially, I think is probably going to be lithium, as we get all enamored with electric stuff, wind power and all that kind of stuff. Because lithium, that's the only reasonable, lithium batteries, the only reasonable density storage media that we have right now, and that's mostly concentrated in Chile and Bolivia, I think. So that could be every bit the problem that the Middle East was not too long ago, at least in the middle term, if we focus on electrical power. So.
Sir, with we have the piracy presence in the Horn of Africa region, but with the increased port development on the western African coast, do you anticipate trade patterns starting to shift down there, and therefore an increased security presence would be needed?
Certainly piracy on the west coast of Africa is becoming a problem. It has been for a while. Bunkering and low-level piracy has been going on there for a long time. How much development really happens along the coast of Africa remains to be seen. I mean, certainly I hope so, but unfortunately Africa, by and large, is still a primary commodity-driven economy. It's been growing 6, 7, 8%. The economies in general for the last few years, again, driven largely by prices and commodities. So whether or not that continues remains to be seen. Certainly, if development out of primary commodities happens, there will be changes in trade patterns, and more ships will be calling there than there are now, and we're going to end up with the same sorts of issues there that we had for a while out in the Gulf, in the Gulf of Aden, in that area. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Sir, I'm an exchange officer from Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, and in Japanese Navy, we are starting to implement maritime domain awareness concept, controlling of white track data. And I'm not a subject matter expert, but between Japanese Navy and US Navy, they are talking about exchanging those white track data through GCCS mic, and that's being processed. And when Japanese Navy was asking Ministry of Transportation and the various shipping companies for receiving information on shipping, what we had was the challenge we had was the companies to release us various shipping information, because those information were information that benefited various companies, and they didn't want. It seemed though like they didn't really want to disclose those information for competitive reasons. When United States, for example, asked various shipping companies to release those shipping information, was there any challenge involved in that process? Maybe the companies didn't want to disclose, or
I can only speak for what we do, because I personally was involved in it. It depends on what kind of shipping. First, from my perspective anyway, I'm not too concerned about anyone knowing where container ships are, largely because that's, our schedules are on the internet. We want customers to know that. So